Hey guys, tonight we're going to continue our study of the survey of the Bible that we started back a couple weeks ago, I guess. Things are going to be a little bit different this time. I'm not going to have my face there in the corner for a couple of reasons. I guess really just one reason. The biggest reason is because it took 17 hours for my computer to save that video, and in this way it only takes a few minutes. So I didn't want to put that much strain on my computer again. I do apologize about that because I really enjoyed that format. This one's not much different. So we talked about how the Bible was laid out there a couple weeks ago in our first lesson, and then our second lesson. This is really a continuation of our second lesson, but the first part of our second lesson, we talked about the creation, if you remember, and we also talked about not Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve, and the fall of mankind there in Genesis chapter 3. And then, of course, we talked about Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. So today we're going to switch over and we're going to talk about three more of the five stories. Remember, there's five stories in Genesis chapters 1 through 11 um, that is before Abraham was born. And so here we are going to think about Cain and Abel. Now, in Genesis 3, of course, we had the fall of humanity. So what we're going to look at now is the fact that it will actually be the continuation of the fall of man. So the idea really is that things are going from bad to worse. And how quickly sin, even though what Adam and Eve did, we might look at it and say, well, that wasn't that big of a deal. But what Adam and Eve did by deciding for themselves what good and evil to define for themselves, the difference between good and evil, that leads to several other things. And it just keeps going from bad to worse. Now, as you read Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 through 16, if you have your Bibles, you can pause me to open up your Bible and take a look at that. That's what we're going to talk about for the next several minutes. But you're going to see this obviously is the first murder. There's obviously more people on earth at this point than Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel. I don't know how many kids Adam and Eve had. Cain apparently is the firstborn. Abel may have been the secondborn. I really don't know. But as we'll see, Cain gets married after this. So there's apparently more people on the earth at that time. So that gives us an indication that Cain and Abel were not children, as you see in the books, in the children's story books. When Cain killed Abel, they would have been adults, maybe in their 40s, maybe a little younger, maybe not even until their hundreds. I mean, these guys were living a long time, so it's really hard to determine how old they would have been, but not likely would they have been children, small children at all. When you look at this story, a lot of times we project the ideas that secularism has on ancient humanity. And the idea is that secularism, that is non-religious folk, I suppose, if you want to use that terminology, the idea that they have is that ancient people were cavemen. There were cavemen, and that does fit into the biblical narrative, but probably not till after the flood. And they probably didn't last very long. But at the same time, there's still a lot of people, even now, who live in caves. So it doesn't mean much. Now, the idea of cavemen was that the ancient peoples were not much more than what we like to call Neanderthals. And up until recently, people have thought Neanderthals were a different species of human. But we're starting to realize, science is finally starting to realize that that wasn't the case at all. They just maybe was a different group of people that looked different. Because they did, in fact, there are still people today who are known to have those genes from those ancient people. But anyhow, cavemen, the idea of cavemen, that Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve were cavemen, is really ridiculous. And so we get the idea that the only thing they knew how to do with stone, and we project what we know about ancient history post flood to what Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel were going through, and that doesn't make any sense. Between Adam and Eve to the flood, there's several generations, thousands of years. It's been about, I guess, 4,000 years, a little bit more since the flood, and we've technologically advanced, especially in the last 100 years. Those folks were living a lot longer than we live, and so there's no telling what they were able to do before the flood. The idea that they were cavemen and that Cain was killing Abel with a stone is not a biblical idea, but rather a projection of our lack of imagination upon what these people were able to do. The interesting thing is when you're reading the ancient language, the Hebrew language, it has some different subtleties in it than what English does. The word for murder there, they have different words for murder. The word for murder was that he was slaughtered. Cain slaughtered Abel just like Abel slaughtered his animals. So it was done with a knife. Maybe it was a stone knife. I don't know, but it was done with a knife in the same manner that an animal was slaughtered, for sacrifice or for consumption before before it's produced for food. Abel's sacrifice. Well, what was the reason for this? Well, Abel's sacrifice was accepted by God, while Cain's wasn't. A lot of people will try to get all these ideas and very dogmatic about why Abel's sacrifice was accepted and Cain's wasn't. We have absolutely no idea what was going on. Some will say, well, Abel sacrificed meat while and animals, while Cain but offered up vegetables, and vegetables was not an acceptable sacrifice, while an animal sacrifice was. That ignores several different things. First of all, it does ignore the fact that Cain was a farmer. He grew crops, whereas Abel was one who tended the herds. So they were offering that which they grew in thanksgiving to God. Nowhere does this mention that this is a sacrifice for the atonement of sin. There are sacrifices in Israel's law that were not vegetable, but sometimes they were not meat, but sometimes they were vegetable offerings, drink offerings, and so we're likely seeing something like that here. In the overall context of the scripture, when someone's sacrifice is not accepted, it's because their heart's not right with God. There's something inside of Cain that's broken, and he's being selfish, and that's really what the text gives us an idea of. Because of this, Cain becomes enraged with jealousy. He begins to premeditate what he's going to do to his brother. And God actually reaches out to Cain, as you see there in verses 7 through 8. But Cain wouldn't listen, and he ultimately abandons reason, and he does one of the most unthinkable things that a person could do, and that's murdering anyone. He murders his own brother. So as you continue to read there, you're going to notice that you're going to come across one of the most famous conversations in the Bible. After Abel is murdered, God says, "Where is your brother?" Cain says, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And then after that, God pronounces punitive actions against Cain. It breaks the relationship completely that he and God had, completely destroyed. He was cast from the presence of God utterly, and he had to go to another location. However, God does remain merciful to him. He does not require his blood. But as you will continue to read through there, you'll see that Cain's descendants followed in his footsteps. And then, as you go back to chapter 5 and verse 4, if you want to go ahead and pause and take a look at that verse. We see that Adam and Eve had many more children, which probably there was some overlap with Cain and Abel, leading to their daughters. And of course, that's where Cain would have gotten his wife, as far as we know. There's no other reason to think otherwise. And the reason for that is because all of us have been descended from Adam, um, and that's how, I mean, the New Testament talks about that. So it's more than likely all of Adam or Cain got his wife as his sister. That kind of thing happened back then. Um, but I'm just going to leave it at that. I don't want to get into any bigger discussion. There are other things that we could talk about. I don't want to talk about this evening or on this lesson. They had other children. One's name was Seth, and it would be his descendant Noah that would build the ark. In the days around Seth's age, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. So there was a great revival among people, and eventually Noah would come, and therefore, because Noah descended from Seth, every human being alive today is descended from Noah through his sons, either Shem, Ham, or Japheth. Most people probably have a combination of those genetics from those three boys. Mainly folks that we are going to be around, not all of them, but most of the folks that we're going to be around are going to come from Japheth. That's Japheth settles northern Europe, and then Ham settles Africa and the Middle East. So those are the two that we probably will see the most of. The next thing that we see is the flood, and that takes place in Genesis chapters 6 through 9. Again, a lot of time has passed from the creation of Adam to the creation of Eve. In fact, the book of Genesis, especially the first 11 chapters, takes up more time than the rest of the Bible put together, by far. In fact, the book of Genesis from chapter 1 to chapter 12 takes up probably at least half to maybe 3/4 of the time, since since let me see how I want to say this, since let's see here, probably took about 2,000 years. So let me rephrase that. It took about 2,000 years from creation to the flood. I said 4,000 earlier, I think, or it was 4,000 years ago since the flood. That's right. So about 2,000 years from the flood, looking back to creation, and then after that you have from the Tower of Babel on, you have probably a few hundred years. So you're looking at probably at least no less than 2,500 years taking place in the book of Genesis. Abraham was about 1800 BC, which is before Christ, and then of course Jesus was born, and now here we are 2,000 some odd years later since Jesus. So we have that. So you see the time periods that we have in Genesis took up a large portion of that time. Genesis 1 through 11 was longer than the time that we have seen from the time of Jesus to our time, is what I'm trying to say. But anyway, by this point, humanity has populated the earth. We don't know how many people were on the earth at that time. However, seeing that we have a pretty big population here on the earth right now, and we only live at this point anywhere from 70 to 90 years. I don't know exactly what the current lifespan is, average lifespan, but we don't live a horribly long time, and we've populated the earth pretty quickly. You can imagine how fast they were populating the earth then, because people were having children hundreds of years after our lifespan's over. They were living, some of them were living, like Methuselah lives up to be 969 years old. Those are actual years. That's not, people like to say, well, they counted time different. No, they didn't. They did not count time different than what we do today. They went by a lunar calendar, which is still the same amount of days, and that's where we get our months. So we have a combination of really a lunar calendar and a solar calendar. They didn't count time any different. In fact, in some places in the world, they had a more sophisticated way of telling time than what we do even now. Um, Maybe not since the atomic age, but up until the atomic age, they some of them are more accurate. Some of their calendars are more accurate than what our more modern calendars have been up until probably the atomic clocks and satellite clocks. But as we see here, the whole world has been filled, and millions, if not billions, of people are populating the earth. But they're corrupt and evil. And it says that God is sorry that he ever even made man. And so he begins the plan to wipe wipe the earth clean. He only finds one righteous man, that is Noah. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 8. He was a righteous man in his generations, which doesn't mean that he was perfect. It just means, comparatively speaking, he was a good guy. Um, as you continue to see there, God, it says that God would cause it to rain for 40 days and 40 nights. Please, and that's in Genesis chapter 7, verses 4 and 12. Please do not fall into the trap. Hearing people say, well, it never rained until Noah. That the Bible does not say that. In fact, the kind of rain that is going on here is the kind of rain that we have never seen before. We could have a downpour for 40 days, the hardest downpour that you can imagine, for 40 days and 40 nights, and all over the earth. And we'd have floods, but it wouldn't flood the whole thing. Because when you look at it, it also says that the fountains of the deep are opened. So water was coming from above, water was coming from beneath. There's some evidence that suggests that there may have been a comet strike around this time, which would have affected the Earth. So you just like get the idea that the Earth was just being bombarded with horrible, horrible things, all from the standpoint of God's judgment upon it because of the corruption and the evil and the violence that people were indulging in from the time that they were young until the time that they died. And so God tells Noah to prepare for this. He gives him a while. He gives him about 100 years to prepare. And so to save Noah, his family, and the animal, God commands the construction of a large vessel that we call the ark. Genesis chapter 6:19 and 7 verse 2. When you look at the dimensions of the ark, it was about a football and a half, 1.5 football fields long, so 450 feet, and was taller than a three-story building. In fact, the entire dimensions, when you look at it, was 450 by 75 by 45. That's in Genesis 6:15. When you take cubits and you do the math, the decks, there were 3 decks, and the dimensions of each deck were 33,750 feet, which gave them a total space of 1.5 million. That's 1.5 million cubic feet. So when someone says, was there enough room for all of the animals? The answer to that question is an absolute yes. Because even now, there is about 1 million species on the earth. 95% of the species on earth could have lived outside of the ark. What do I mean by that? Well, they were water animals. They didn't need to be in the ark, obviously. So therefore, there would have been no more than 50,000 animals living on the ark. The average size of an animal is that of a sheep. Some would say, well, what about, elephants? Things like, well, they're babies. You're going to want to bring the youngest. Someone even say, well, what about dinosaurs? Well, I don't know what happened to the dinosaurs. Don't know that for sure. I've got some ideas. But if they were around, they would have been put on the ark. And what about those gigantic ones? Well, not very many gigantic dinosaurs out there. Hollywood likes to make us feel like all the dinosaurs were huge. Most of them were actually around the size of chickens or dogs. But there were big ones. But even the biggest dinosaur were babies, and they weren't that big. So there would have been plenty of room even for them if we want to go that route. Because simple calculations show that all the animals would have fit on one deck, which left the other 2 for storage of food, water, other purposes like housing for the families. Noah and his family spent about 53 weeks, not quite, but about 53 weeks on the ark. So over a year, a little over a year. Eventually the waters decline and they disembark onto dry ground and to a new earth. As the Bible says in the New Testament, the world that then was perished. It didn't support us as well as the one before, because what we're going to begin to see is after the flood, people who were living nearly a millennia, they begin to die much earlier, at a pretty rapid pace. Within just a few generations, we're down to the 200s, and just a few generations after that, we're down to about where we are now. So the earth is completely different. We are living in a post-apocalyptic world that most people is happened so long ago that most people don't even realize it or believe it, because it has just become business as usual. But as they disembark from the earth, Noah worships God in gratitude, Genesis chapter 8, verses 20 through 21. And in turn, God makes a covenant with humanity in Genesis 9, 1 through 17, that he would never destroy the earth with water again. And he seals that promise with a rainbow. And so anytime you see a rainbow in the sky, you need to give thanks to God for the covenant that continues on even today, that he will not destroy the earth with water ever again, and that forever the seasons will remain, harvest will remain, as he promises there in Genesis 9, 1 through 17. That's what the rainbow originally means. I'm not going to get into what people have turned it into today, but the rainbow originally is the seal of promise that no matter what, God will not destroy the earth with water ever again. And even though the flood cleansed the earth of the evil of humanity for a time, it did not clean the heart, because sin's still a problem. We're going to see Noah gets intoxicated shortly um, after he disembarks. We see Canaan, or we see Ham mistreating Noah, his father. And then, of course, we see the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9, which is shortly after the flood. There's a few generations, but people are gathering together. They're huddling together. God commanded that the earth be repopulated in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 1. However, people did not want to do that for whatever reason. People get used to things, and they don't want to get out of their comfort zone. So the people are all still huddled together, and they're there in what we know as Iraq today, but it was the beginning of Babylon, which is going to be something that comes up in the Bible all the way through Revelation as Babylon. The people display their sinful pride in the construction of a great city with a tower that reached into heaven. We don't know why they were building that tower for sure. Some have suggested that maybe they built it and wanted to build it to heaven because they were told through the histories and the oral traditions that had already led up to that point that the flood covered the mountains, so they wanted to go even higher than the mountains, and that way if there was another flood, they wouldn't be destroyed. Someone might say, well, there wasn't going to be another flood. God said there wasn't going to be another flood. Well, yes, but God says a lot of things that people don't believe. So, I mean, that's a very real possibility. That's what happened. But they gather together. They don't do what God said to do, regardless of what may have been the reason. They don't do what God said to do. They're not spreading out over the earth as they were commanded. God forces the issue. He comes down. He confuses their language into different groups. The people start spreading out. I don't know what all languages were from that. Most of the languages we have today are relatively new languages. English is a new language. We can trace the development of English back, and it is well after the Tower of Babel that we can begin to see it coming about. Chinese actually is believed to be one of the original languages after the Tower of Babel, and a couple of others that are still probably floating around out there, but certainly not as many as we have now. We just continue coming up with new nuances and new languages as we evolve and we divide against one another and have different cultures. That's the kind of thing that we continue to see happening. But this narrative, as we see, the name of the book of Genesis literally means book of beginnings. So we've seen the beginning of the world, we've seen the beginning of humanity, really the beginning of the universe, the beginning of earth, the beginning of humanity and all creation. We've seen the end, we've seen the new beginning, and Noah and his family. And then in Genesis chapter 11, we see the beginning of Babylon. So starting in Genesis 12, Moses is going to go a different direction. There's a lot of other things that we'd like to know about that we don't have answers to. But he's going to go a different direction, in the direction that needed to be done at the time because they were concerned with Israel. So we're going to see the beginning of the nation of Israel starting in Genesis chapter 12 with the patriarch known as Abraham. Thank everybody for listening this evening. I hope you all have a good day tomorrow or the rest of your evening or whatever time of day this may be. And we will see you soon. God bless.